The sun dipped low over the dusty horizon, casting long shadows across the barren fields. Eloan stood at the edge of the ranch, her dark, burned eyes dull yet piercing, absorbing the silence. A gentle breeze stirred the parched grass, bringing whispers of a life left behind. Silas emerged from the weathered barn, his face etched with lines of solitude, eyes hidden beneath a felt hat. He moved with an unsettling calm, the weight of untold secrets lingering in his wake. As they locked gazes, a quiet understanding passed between them, a bond forged in silence. Every creak of the wooden fence felt like a muffled scream, the air thick with unspoken truths. Eloan clutched a small, worn-out doll, its fabric stained with memories, while Silas shifted his weight, the heaviness of his past casting a long shadow. Together, they shared the burden of their histories, one unvoiced, the other wrapped in darkness. Eloan stood on the wooden platform, the sun blazing overhead, glaring down like an unrelenting spotlight. Her heart pounded in her chest, a constant drum echoing the panic that wrapped around her throat like a vice. She barely recognized the faces staring at her, some filled with pity, others with cold hunger. She thought of her brother, the look in his eyes as he sealed her fate with a nod to the man who had come to take her away. The bitter memory twisted inside her, sharp as a knife. Had it been worth it? The weight of her brother's betrayal hung heavy, a cascade of disbelief churning through her as she recalled the desperate arguments, her pleas for freedom drowned by his callous indifference. Silas leaned against the weathered rail, his rugged hands gripping the splintered wood tightly, as if it were the only thing holding him steady. The ranch was a fading shadow of prosperity, and the people who came to bid for Eloan treated her as a mere object, something to be owned. He felt the heat radiate from the ground beneath him, mixing with the bitterness that had settled deep in his gut. He didn't want any part of this, but need drove him. A hunger for redemption, for a flicker of warmth in a life once consumed by darkness. But she was more than a commodity. He watched her, the way she held herself, defiant yet trembling, and something stirred in him, an instinct to protect. In Eloan's eyes, the color of burnt copper and framed by soot-black lashes, burned with unshed tears and stories of silent battles, moments of despair and flashes of shattered dreams. A deep, aching rage simmered within her, born not just from the way she had been discarded, but from the horror that awaited her. It felt like drowning, the air heavy with the stench of overripe emotions. The whispers of her aunt's words clawed at her mind, promises of safety exchanged for the illusion of a better life, twisted into a cruel joke. She imagined herself as an ember, flickering in the dark, waiting to be snuffed out completely. Silas shifted on his feet, every breath heavy with anticipation and regret. He hadn't wanted to buy her. He needed someone to help mend the wounds left by his past. The darkness had claimed too many lives, and now it beckoned him to stand witness to another form of suffering, the suffering of the girl before him. He saw the burn that marred her irises, a physical manifestation of her trauma, a story he could almost feel. It made him want to reach out, to touch her shoulder and say, "You're safe now." But he didn't. Instead, he remained a spectator, his lips pressed together in silence. Eloan's gaze flicked across the crowd, catching sight of men who reveled in their power and women whose eyes glistened with false sympathy. She felt barbed wires coil around her chest, squeezing tighter with each passing moment. She thought of the warm summers spent in her aunt's garden and the laughter that had once filled the air before it turned to ash. The tension of loss and abandonment shadowed every breath she took. To be sold like livestock was a nightmare she had never imagined, each heartbeat a reminder of her dislocation. She was a girl no longer. She was a pawn in an unforgiving game. The auctioneer's voice rang out, and a shiver coursed through her. Silas could feel the jagged edges of his own scarred history scraping against the present. The bidding began, each offer a nail driven into the coffin of her freedom. His heart raced as he fought against the instinct to clam up, to turn away. But still, a strange compulsion anchored him to the spot, compelling him to see her through this moment. There remained a flicker of that old instinct for protection, an impulse formed in the shadows of his own suffering. Elawan caught Silas's eye, her expression caught between fear and defiance, a silent scream trapped beneath the surface. In that heartbeat, a shared understanding lingered in the air. Two souls burdened by their pasts, bound by the invisible chains of trauma. She wanted to scream, to cry out that they couldn't let this happen, that she had fought for too long to let the darkness consume her. But words failed her. All she could do was stare, willing him to be different, to be something more than a buyer, more than another man eager to claim her flesh. Silas felt drawn to her, the gravity of her pain pulling at threads deep within him that had long been left untouched. Yet as the bids rose, so did the chasm between them, a vast emptiness filled with uncertainty and despair. He couldn't allow himself to feel connected. He couldn't bridge that distance without risking everything he had fought to survive. Even as the sparks of compassion flared in his heart, he reminded himself, the darker the past, the harder the road to redemption. Elawan stood there, the auctioneer's voice a distant hum as the world around her blurred. With each bid, her heart hardened, encasing her emotions in layers she feared she could never peel back. She was losing herself in a world that had never needed her, a pawn exchanged in a game she didn't understand. Desolation washed over her, and all she could do was brace for whatever fate awaited at the end of this transaction. Elawan stepped off the creaking wagon, her heart thundering like the hooves of the horses that had dragged her across the parched landscape. The dry air clung to her skin as she blinked, adjusting to the brightness that fell over the ranch like a spotlight on a forgotten stage. The wooden structure loomed before her, weathered and worn, much like the memories she carried in the depths of her burned eyes. She looked down, tracing the contours of her scars with hesitant fingers, a reminder of a past she couldn't escape. This was her new home, a place that smelled of hay and sadness, echoed in the silence that stretched across the yard. Silas emerged from the shadows of the barn, his silhouette stark against the late afternoon sun. With the brim of his weathered hat casting a shadow over his face, he regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. Elawan felt her throat tighten. There was something unnerving in the way he studied her, as if he were weighing her worth against the weight of his own unspeakable sins. The air between them was thick, filled with unvoiced questions and a history neither had the courage to unveil. She shifted her weight from one foot to another, feeling the coldness of the earth seep into her bones. "Welcome to Dark Past Ranch," he finally said, his voice low and gravelly, a stark contrast to the cheerful greetings she had imagined. Elawan nodded, not trusting her own voice to respond. The weight of her new reality settled heavily on her shoulders. Without further words, Silas turned, leading her inside. Elawan followed, her heartbeat quickening with each step. She was aware of the silence that enveloped them, a silence that felt like an unbreakable bond between them, forged by the secrets they both harbored. The interior was dim, shadows dancing along the walls as lights struggled to break through the grimy windows. Dust motes floated like distant memories, and the scent of damp wood hung thick in the air. Silas gestured toward a small room at the end of the hallway, a space that seemed to sigh with abandonment. This was her sanctuary now, a box of solitude with peeling wallpaper and a single bed draped with a faded quilt. It wasn't much, but it was better than the cage of her aunt's home. With a breath that felt like liberation, Elawan stepped inside, claiming the space as her own while bracing herself against the chill of the ranch and the shadows of its owner. Days slipped by slowly, the monotony of chores filling her time. Elawan learned to milk the cows, feed the chickens, and mend the broken fence that separated the past from the present. Silas, always in the periphery, observed her with a quiet intensity that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. He would sometimes stand at the edge of the field, arms crossed, his weathered face unreadable. When he did speak, his words were clipped and pragmatic, offering little warmth. There was a part of her that wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance that felt both terrifying and tangible. Yet another part whispered caution, reminding her of the burn and the scars they both wore. As nights fell, the ranch transformed. The sky erupted in a riot of stars, sparkling like scattered dreams against the inky backdrop. Elowen stood at her window, looking out with her burned eyes, trying to find solace in the beauty of the night. But there was a darkness that lingered beneath even the most celestial of nights, a darkness that seemed to pulse in time with Silas's own. She caught snippets of conversations between him and the townsfolk, vague murmurs that clawed at the edges of her curiosity. Whispers of things left unsaid hovered in the air, mingling with her own troubled thoughts. Silas would return home late, shadows heavy on his shoulders, and the air would thicken with an unshakable tension. Elowen often wondered what he hid beneath his stoic facade. Did he feel the weight of the world pressing against him, or was he so far removed from emotion that it barely registered? There was a moment, one silent evening as they shared a sparse meal, when she dared to peek beneath the surface of his guarded soul. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting heartbeat she thought she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his gaze. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by an impenetrable wall that left her feeling more isolated than ever. In the quiet of the night, her thoughts spiraled, and she recalled every detail she had tucked away into the recesses of her mind. Images of her aunt's cruel laughter, the way she had traded Elowen's life like a mere possession. She had been sold to this man, this rancher with a dark past, and the edges of her world began to blur into questions. What had he done to be so haunted? What secrets lurked in the corners of this ranch that could rewrite the story of her life? She knew there was a darkness within Silas, one that mirrored her own struggles, and despite the fear that gripped her, an ember of determination ignited within her. Elowen was not just a girl with burned eyes, she was a survivor, and survival meant unraveling the truth, no matter how deep it lay buried beneath the surface of Dark Past Ranch. Elowen rose at dawn, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, casting a soft glow on the rugged landscape surrounding the ranch. Each morning began the same way, the air crisp and filled with the earthy scent of damp soil. She moved through the narrow halls of the old wooden house, still waking from the knots of sleep grasping at her mind. The crackling of the stove heralded the start of breakfast, but it was Silas's heavy footsteps that pulled her from her thoughts. There was something grounding in his presence, even as uncertainty curled around her heart like ivy. Silas was an enigma, a man cloaked in shadows, with a history that hung over him like the low-hanging clouds that often rolled across the valley. He had saved her from her aunt, from a life she barely remembered, and yet even as she shared this small space with him, there was a silence between them that felt insurmountable. As Elowen prepared breakfast, her hands moved deftly, almost mechanically, while her mind wandered to the stories she had heard whispered in dark corners, the rumors of dark pasts and unspoken sins that clung to Silas like a second skin. The clatter of plates was a familiar sound, but today it felt laden with unspoken questions. Silas watched her from where he sat at the weathered table, a hard line etched across his jaw. She stole glances at him, noting the way his brow furrowed in thought. Behind those piercing eyes lay a depth she was both drawn to and terrified of. Elowen struggled with her own emotions, balancing the gratitude she owed him for rescuing her and the instinctual wariness that flared up like a flame whenever she recalled why she had come to this ranch, the stories of his past gnawing at her resolve. As the days turned into weeks, their routines settled into a rhythm. Silas taught her about the ranch, explaining the intricacies of the land, the ebb and flow of the seasons. He took her along with him when he tended to the animals, showing her how to handle the horses and feed the livestock. While Silas's touch was gentle, His words often held an edge, biting at the edges of her confidence. She sensed there was a storm brewing within him, a churning dissatisfaction he hardly dared voice. And as he shared snippets of his life, she felt a magnetic pull, an urge to delve deeper into the shadows of his past, yet fear held her back. In the evenings, after the chores were done and the sky melted into shades of orange and purple, they sat on the porch. The silence between them stretched, sometimes filled with the chirping of crickets or the distant howl of the wind, but often it simmered thick with unspoken tensions. Iloan would gaze into the horizon, feeling the weight of her own secrets pressing against her heart, and beneath the surface, both of them danced around a truth neither dared to confront. She wanted to ask him about the darkness she sensed lurking just below his tough exterior, but the words always caught in her throat. One flickering night, the stillness shattered when a storm rolled in, unleashing a torrent of rain that pounded against the roof. The two of them huddled inside, the sound both comforting and overwhelming. It was in this cocoon of chaos that Silas finally spoke, his voice low and heavy. He shared a fragment of a memory, a fleeting moment from his past that tugged at the edges of his soul, a ghost of regret. Iloan felt herself lean in, drawn closer to him, yet her heart raced in tandem with the thunder outside, battling the urge to lay bare her own demons. As Silas spoke, Iloan noticed the flicker of pain in his eyes, one that mirrored her own. She opened her mouth, the truth slipping out before she could catch it. "You're not the only one with a past," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the downpour. The room grew dense with emotion, a palpable tension that shifted the air around them. In that moment, vulnerability hung between them like an electric spark, and she realized they were both haunted by shadows, each masked in their own protective layers, each too fearful to let the other in completely. The storm raged on, but a thin thread of understanding began to weave through their shared silence. For the first time, Iloan dared to explore the intricacies of his heart. She could see the very real fear that flickered behind Silas's chestnut eyes, the urgency of breath as he held back the tumult of his stories. She wanted to know him, truly know him, yet something deeper within her whispered to tread carefully, to let the storm in rather than cast it away. The bond between them was frail yet charged, like a flickering candle that could either ignite a flame or extinguish under the weight of their burdens. As they sat there, soaked in shadows and rain, Iloan felt the world outside fade away. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between them, but something held her back, an instinct that perhaps the truth would unravel everything. And there, in the midst of the storm, both souls stood on the precipice of connection, teetering between the desire to understand and the fear of what that understanding might reveal. Iloan leaned against the cool wooden frame of the barn, the faint smell of hay mixing with the sharp tang of earth. The sun dipped low, casting elongated shadows that danced like ghosts around her. She watched Silas from a distance, the rancher who brought her into this world of sun-bleached landscapes and faded dreams. He was hunched over a saddle, the muscles in his back taut with concentration, but his brow furrowed in a way that made her wonder if he was as strong as he looked. He had been kind, sometimes. He would allow her to roam the property, a freedom she had not known in her aunt's home. But there were moments when his kindness felt like a hush before a storm, an unspoken threat lingering in the air. He had a darkness that wrapped around him like a second skin, one that frightened her and made her curious all at once. She hoped she could peel back the layers, expose the man beneath the rugged exterior, but fear held her firm. Could she trust him with the remnants of her burned past? "Everything all right?" Silas's voice broke through the silence, rough yet gentle. It was a question, but it was also an invitation. He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes scanning her face with an intensity that made her heart race. It was the first time she noticed the depth of his gaze, how it seemed to hold both warmth and an unfathomable shadow. Something within her urged her to speak, to pull at the invisible thread between them. She hesitated, the weight of her experiences wrapping around her throat like a noose. "Just thinking," she finally murmured. A simple answer, yet it felt like a betrayal of everything unspoken. She wanted to tell him about the nights spent in her aunt's house, about the hush that fell over the family when her father's name was mentioned, but she was terrified of how he would react. Would he see her as damaged, a burden? Or worse, would he see her as another plaything in his dark game? "Thinking about what?" he pressed, taking a step closer. The warmth emanating from him drew her near, but an instinct bubbled in her chest to retreat. "I won't bite." A flicker of a smile ghosted across his lips, but she had seen the way his hands sometimes clenched into fists, the way his jaw tightened when he thought no one was watching. Those small gestures told a story, one she feared to unravel. I just wonder what happens next." The admission felt heavy on her tongue, clumsy in its simplicity. "This place is different. There's a stillness that feels strange." Her heart raced at the honesty, at the vulnerability she had allowed to slip through the cracks. Would it scare him away? Silas's expression shifted, a glimmer of understanding lighting his eyes. "Sometimes the silence is louder than the noise," he said quietly, his voice low and gravelly. She studied his face, trying to decipher the hidden layers beneath the surface, the forgotten dreams and regrets embroidered into his skin. For a moment, they shared a palpable sense of isolation, each wrestling with shadows that loomed just out of reach. "What about you?" Elowen dared to ask, emboldened by the way his vulnerability softened the tension in the air. "Is this all you want?" There it was, her heart laid bare, aching to bridge the gap between them. His eyes darkened, and for a heartbeat, she feared she had crossed a line. The air crackled with unspoken truths. Silas took a step back, breaking the fragile connection. She watched as he wrestled with emotions she could almost feel, a torrent that flared in his eyes before he cloaked himself in a mask of indifference. "You think I wanted this?" The bitterness in his voice caught her off guard, slicing through the silence with the sharpness of a knife. "I came here to escape, to bury something that won't stay buried." The admission hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, they stood as two shattered souls, hovering on the brink of understanding. Elowen's heart ached at the glimpse she had caught into his turmoil, a reflection of her own scars. "We can't outrun our past," she whispered almost to herself, the weight of her truth hanging between them. The twilight deepened around them, wrapping them in an uncharacteristic intimacy, a shared acknowledgement of hurt. An unbreakable bond, forged not in the light, but in the shadows they carried within. The shadows in the barn stretched and swayed, illuminated by the flickering remnants of daylight filtering through cracked wood. Elowen stood by the open stall, her fingers brushing against the rough surface of the hay, her mind consumed by unspeakable memories. Silas was on the other side, his silhouette framed against the fading sun. An unspoken tension simmered in the air, thick as the dust that settled between them. The silence felt heavy, yet it was a silence laden with a peculiar understanding, one that both frightened and comforted her. Silas moved closer, his steps cautious as if approaching a wounded animal. He noticed the way Elowen's body was taut, her shoulders tense. He had seen that look before, fear tightly wound with defiance. His heart ached at the thought of being yet another monster in her life, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were bound together by more than mere circumstance. A connection flickered between them, uncharted but electric, a shared understanding of pain etched into each of their pasts. "Is it always like this?" Elowen's voice was barely above a whisper, choked with memories of despair. She was referring to the ranch, the solitude, and the mundane rhythm of life that seemed to thrum with the weight of dark secrets. Silas turned sharply, the question cutting through his thoughts. He had never been one to discuss his life, yet here was this girl, a stranger wrapped in her own scars, asking the question he had never dared to articulate. "Sometimes it feels like the land remembers," Silas replied, his voice gruff yet tender. It holds on to what's buried deep beneath the surface. His gaze flickered over to her burned eyes, a mirror of the scars he kept hidden. He had always faced the specter of regret, but speaking of it to Elowen felt different. It felt like a step toward healing. He took a breath, the air thick with vulnerability. I think we carry our history with us until we find a way to let go. Elowen searched his face, her heart racing as recognition ignited within her. She had never met a man who dared to acknowledge the darkness that lurked in the corners of their lives, let alone one who seemed to wear it so openly. "And how do you let go?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. She could see the pain etched in the lines of his face, a deep well of sorrow that echoed her own. In that moment, she understood that they were not so different after all. Silas took a step closer, closing the distance that had felt insurmountable until now. His hand, rough and calloused, reached out hesitantly, hovering just above her shoulder as if unsure of how to bridge the chasm between them. In that fleeting second, the weight of their shared experiences hung in the air, the unsaid things forming a bond that neither had anticipated. "Sometimes you just have to live with it," he murmured, his thumb barely grazing her skin, igniting a spark she didn't know she needed. "And sometimes you find someone who understands." Elowen's breath caught in her throat. The gesture was simple, a touch, a moment of contact, but it resonated deep within the fibers of her being. She could feel the warmth of his skin against her, a stark contrast to the chill that always clung to her. It was a reminder that connection was possible, even for a girl who had been burned by the world. Their gazes locked, and for the first time since her arrival at the ranch, Elowen felt a flicker of hope that perhaps healing was within reach. "I don't want to carry it anymore," she confessed, her heart racing as the vulnerabilities spilled from her lips. "There's too much darkness, and I can't feel it all alone." Silence enveloped the moment, punctuated only by the distant sound of the wind rustling through the barn's timbers. Silas lowered his hand, the warmth lingering in the air between them, filled with unspoken promises and questions waiting to be answered. As their connection deepened, Elowen found solace in the shared quietude. The weight of their pasts seemed lighter, transforming into a fragile thread that tethered them together. Silas nodded slowly, the understanding in his eyes fierce yet gentle. "Then let's figure it out together," he finally said, resolute. In that instant, the barn faded away, and all that mattered was the flickering hope nestled between two souls intertwined by pain and the possibility of something more. Elowen stood in the dim light of the barn, her heart pounding as the sounds of hooves echoed outside. Shadows danced around her, flickering like her thoughts, conflicted and chaotic. Silas had left her alone, the heavy door creaking shut behind him. She felt the weight of the silence pressing down, filling every crevice of her mind. The urge to speak surged within her, a tide of words that had been buried too long, but they were trapped beneath the surface like fish struggling for air. The air smelled of hay and musty wood, tinged with the faintest trace of smoke. She remembered the fire, its ravenous flames licking the edges of her vision, eating away at everything she once knew. A shudder coursed through her as the memories clawed their way back, her aunt's face twisted in anger, the way she had laughed as she sealed her fate with a cruel bargain. The regret twisted in her gut like a barbed wire, and Elowen pressed her palms to her temples, fighting against the storm raging inside her. Silas had been different. He had offered her a glimpse of something she thought lost. His kind gestures, the gentle way he spoke, seemed to peel back layers of her fear and grief. Yet beneath that facade lay shadows of his own, a darkness she sensed but couldn't articulate. How could she trust him? How could she bear to voice her fears? The truth clawed at her throat, desperate to escape, but it brought with it the risk of shattering the fragile peace they had woven together. She remembered the flicker of his eyes when he mentioned the past, the tension that filled the air like static. It was a reminder that the scars of the past were not exclusive to her. They were connected in their histories, woven together by threads of pain. Elowen felt an agonizing pull inside her. She yearned to confront him, to lay bare the truth buried deep in her own soul, yet the fear of what she might unleash held her captive. Elowen closed her eyes, allowing the memories to wash over her. The cold grip of her aunt's hand as it shoved her towards the door of the dimly lit room, the desperate pleas for mercy that fell on deaf ears. Her heart raced, not just from those memories, but from the flicker of resolution igniting within her. Could she reclaim her voice, even if it meant facing the darkness within Silas? The barn door creaked open, and Elowen's breath caught in her throat. Silas stepped back inside, the fading light casting long shadows across his face. There was an intensity in his gaze, a searching quality that made her pulse race. She could see the darkness etched into his features, the lines of worry and regret mingling with those of strength. In that moment, trapped between the urge to speak and the desire to remain silent, she saw the flicker of hope mirrored in his eyes. With trembling hands, she stepped closer. The words threatened to spill over, each one a confession waiting to be spoken. "Silas," she began, her voice wavering but determined. The syllables felt foreign, yet liberating, like a long-lost melody returning to her lips. "I see you." The weight of those words hung between them, thick and tangible, igniting a fragile connection that teetered on the precipice of honesty. Silas's breath hitched, and for a heartbeat, Elowen thought he might retreat. But instead, he held her gaze, an unspoken invitation lingering in the air. She felt the tremors of vulnerability lace through them both, a raw openness that stripped away the walls they had built. "I know there are things you hide," she pressed on, her voice stronger now. "Things we both hide, but I can't pretend anymore." Silas took a step forward, closing the distance. In that sacred moment, Elowen felt the world around them blur. It was just the two of them, bound by an unyielding truth that hung in the air, an offering of understanding and honesty that transcended the shadows of their pasts. The darkness didn't have to consume them. It could be confronted together. Beneath the weight of shared burdens, Elowen felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to hope for. Freedom. Freedom in speaking her truth. Freedom in understanding the complexities of Silas, and freedom from the chains that had bound her heart for far too long. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape of Dark Past Ranch. The earth, warm from the day's embrace, clung to Elowen's bare feet as she stood at the edge of the corral, her heart racing like the hooves of the restless horses within. Silas had been quiet since the day they returned from town. The tension loomed heavy in the air, an uninvited guest that lingered over every shared glance and unspoken word. Elowen brushed her fingers against her collarbone, feeling the ghosts of scars, remnants of a past that she was only beginning to confront. Silas's broad shoulders shifted in the fading light, his stoic demeanor betraying nothing of the storm inside him. He looked out toward the horizon, his eyes searching as if the distant hills contained secrets he had buried deep within. Elowen wanted to reach out, to pull him back from whatever place he drifted to, but fear kept her rooted. The weight of what she had seen pinning her down, the darkened room, the frightened cries she had overheard, the twisted truths that unraveled in fragmented whispers. Those moments replayed relentlessly in her mind. A relentless montage that filled her with both dread and a flicker of resolve. She turned her gaze away, focusing on the horses' restless movements, their breaths forming ghostly clouds in the cool evening air. If only she could harness their wild energy, their instinctual knowing of freedom. But she was tethered here, bound by a sense of obligation and an inexplicable connection to the man who had bought her, heart and soul. Silas pulled her from darkness, yet became a paradox of light and shadow. The weight of his silence pressed against her chest, a visceral reminder of the truth that needed to surface. Gathering her courage, she took a step forward, the dust swirling at her feet like memories trying to escape. "Silas!" she finally called out, her voice breaking the silence like a fragile echo. He turned to her, his eyes narrowing with cautious curiosity. There was a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, before it vanished behind a mask of indifference. But Eowyn no longer wished to be silent. The enormity of her truth, the haunting memories clawing for release, surged within her. "Silas," she said again, this time louder, more insistent. I remember what you did." The words clung to the air like smoke, heavy, yet liberating. She felt the energy shift between them, palpable and raw. Silas remained still, the muscles in his jaw tightening, a man caught between past and present, responsibility and remorse. The sun dipped beneath the horizon, bathing the landscape in an orange glow, casting them in shadows, as though the world held its breath in anticipation. "You think your past doesn't reach forward?" Eowyn continued, the tremor in her voice betraying the tempest within. "You can't buy me, Silas, not when I carry the scars of my aunt's betrayal or the echoes of those nights. You can't sweep that away with kindness or shelter." The horses, sensing the emotional upheaval, neighed softly, their sounds harmonizing with the rising tide of her courage. Each word she spoke became a thread, weaving her truth into the fabric of the night. Silas's expression shifted, unveiling a flicker of vulnerability. "Eowyn," he began, but she pressed on, the fire in her soul igniting her resolve. "This isn't just about us. It's about what you've done, what you still carry with you, the shadows you've cast. I see them, Silas. I see you." Her voice rose, blending strength and vulnerability in a tapestry only their shared history could weave. It was no longer about what had been taken from her, but also what had been hidden in him. For the first time, she allowed herself to breach the silence that had divided them. "I will not be defined by this darkness. You can't silence me with your past anymore." The words spilled out, each syllable shedding layers of fear and uncertainty. The weight of truth flooded the space between them, heavy and electric. Silas's gaze softened, a stormy ocean of regret visible in his eyes. And in that moment, she found her strength. "Silas," she breathed, her heart pounding with the power of his name. It was a breakthrough, a declaration. With that single utterance, the barrier between them cracked like the surface of the earth beneath a sudden rain. "You can be more than your past." There was a vulnerability in her voice, an invitation rather than an accusation. Silas's shoulders sagged, the weight of his secrets laid bare in the twilight. And as the last light faded, a flicker of hope ignited, a promise that together they could forge a new beginning from the darkness that had once consumed them both. The sun dipped low, draping the ranch in a blanket of gold and shadow. Eowyn stood by the edge of the withered field, her burned eyes reflecting the fading light, a testament to battles both fought and unspoken. Silas approached, the weight of his past heavy in the air between them, yet here, amidst the whispers of wind and rustling grass, a fragile truce began to form. He knelt beside her, tracing a finger through the soil, unearthing remnants of life long forgotten. Eowyn watched his hands, rough and scarred, a mirror to her soul. In the stillness, she felt the distance between them soften, like the setting sun melting into the horizon. With a gentle gesture, Silas placed a wildflower in her palm, its vibrant petals a contrast to the muted world around them. She looked down, then back at him, understanding blooming like dawn. In that sacred silence, memories of pain faded, replaced by the delicate promise of new beginnings. As twilight enveloped them, Eowyn pressed the flower to her chest, her heart echoing with unspoken forgiveness. Silas inhaled deeply, the air thick with redemption, knowing that from this moment healing was no longer a solitary journey. Together, they turned toward the horizon, the past behind them, the future unwritten.